Piedmont Triad International Information Bravo, 1754 Zulu winds are 348 at 7 knots. Visibility 10 miles. 2,000 few clouds. 3,900 broken. 5,000 broken. Temperature 14, dew point 4. Current altimeter is 29907. Arriving and departing runway 32.
Hello, Mark Fletcher back with you again. Lately I've been enjoying learning some of the secrets about the G1000nxi. I've been shooting some approaches at Raleigh International, and I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video about some of the things that I'm learning. There are a couple of ways of practicing shooting approaches. One way that allows you to concentrate strictly on the approach itself is to turn off all ATC, like Pilot ATC. And you can do this with or without a flight plan. And if it's an approach I'm not very familiar with, I like to do the whole thing manually for a while before I start bringing in the autopilot. Once I've shot a few approaches that way, I like to introduce Pilot to ATC and get comfortable with that layer of detail. And with respect to ATC, there are a couple of options available. The first option, which I like to call the full procedure, because it typically involves flying the entire approach from an initial approach fix all the way down to the missed approach point. And this is done without any interaction from ATC, either vectoring or altitude changes. Many of the books refer to this as own navigation, also called pilot navigation. The other method, which is more typical, involves receiving radar vectors from ATC, and that includes altitude changes and even an abbreviation of the approach itself. Both of these options are educational, and it's important, I think, to practice both of them. Well, as I've been yakking on to you here, I've been busy entering a flight plan into the G1000. For the purposes of this video, I decided to do the full approach option. And in doing so, I discovered a couple of limitations of Pilot to ATC, which are definitely worth pointing out. What I wanted to do is what we typically do when we're practicing approaches in real life. Similar to doing pattern work, we inform the tower that we'd like to practice a particular instrument procedure, and if they're not too busy, they typically will accommodate. And setting up for an instrument approach is a lot like flying a VFR pattern. We'll fly a downwind leg and turn base to intercept an initial approach fix while descending to a specific altitude. An instrument approach has one or more feeder waypoints called instrument approach fixes. And this IAF is the entry point of the approach. There's a specific altitude associated with the IAF, and we must descend to that altitude upon entry. To fly an approach, we must hear the magic words, "cleared for the approach," from either the approach controller or the tower. Now, what we typically do in real life is locate a convenient waypoint that serves as a good starting point for the downwind leg of the approach and wait for the controller to clear us to begin the approach. So if I'm ignoring ATC and just want to practice an approach, I might fly a route like this. Assuming the active runway is 05 right, I'm going to set a cruising altitude of 7,000 feet because in the SR-22 that's pretty easy to achieve, plus it gives me a little extra practice with VNAV. I like to climb out toward this Nightdale-Wendell area, which gives me plenty of time to get to altitude. So let me switch to the IFR chart here so you can see the waypoint names. So here we are at Windy, and I fully expect to be at 7,000 feet by the time I get to this waypoint. Now SkyVector doesn't show the name of this waypoint, but when I right-clicked on this airway, which happens to be Victor 3, I was able to choose BEICH, which is an initial approach fix for the ILS and RNAV approaches to runway 05 right. Okay, funny side note here. I've always pronounced this beach. Pilot to ATC wants to call it bike. Well, this is important in real life because controllers and pilots alike always try to pronounce these intersection and approach waypoints, so I'm going to try to learn to say bike. And this is actually an area where the FAA shows just a little bit of sense of humor because some of these approach names are really pretty comical. Alright, well, if I click on flight plan up here, you can see that I've set my departure to KRDU, that's Raleigh-Durham International, and I'm flying out to the Windy intersection, and from there I go to beach or bike, and from there I'll choose my approach. We'll talk more about making a good approach selection in a bit, but the approach I'm choosing is the RNAV GPS Yankee runway 05 right. And if I open that approach plate, you see all the detail about this particular approach. A couple of things I'll point out here. Notice there are two initial approach fixes. Here's one, autos, and then the one that we chose, which is bike. That means there are two entry points into this particular approach. And if we were going to request a full approach, we would choose one of these two entry points. But if we were on vectors, the controller could bring us into any of these waypoints. More about that later. And one final point, notice that the entry altitude at bike is 5,000 feet. We're cruising at 7,000 feet, so that means we're going to have to get down 2,000 feet by the time we get to bike, and we use VNAV to do that. Now let's talk about using Pilot ATC to fly this approach. I mentioned before that I noticed a limitation with Pilot ATC. Well, when I tried this with no flight plan and then contacted Raleigh Tower after crossing the windy intersection, no matter what I said, the tower insisted on giving me vectors. I knew from past experience if I requested the approach in this manner, I should get a full, that is, on navigation clearance. Raleigh Tower, November 227 Whiskey Alpha, at 7,000 feet, requests the RNAV approach to runway 05 right with the bike transition. Using the Say It feature, I tried every grammar rule that I could find, and absolutely nothing would make this work. So it was on to attempt number 2. I was reluctant to create a flight plan because I was trying not to overcomplicate this, and I also wanted to make it as true to life as possible. But because I couldn't get Pilot to ATC to give me a full procedure, I caved. So I created KRDU as both the departure and the arrival airport, and I added the windy intersection. Then I added the approach. Runway 05 right, and then the approach is RNAV R05 right Yankee right here, and then transition bike. When I tried to fly this, it was a disaster. After trying this several times, Pilot ATC was totally confused. Sometimes there was no response at all. Other times I got a 1200 squawk and instructions to enter a right VFR pattern. Well, I finally realized the main problem was the departure and arrival airport being the same was the source of the confusion. So it was on to attempt number 3. So in this final attempt to get Pilot to ATC to work with my practice approaches, I decided to fly out from a nearby airport. There's a number of worthwhile choices. Raleigh Executive down here is a good choice. Siler City Municipal, Causey, Asheboro Regional. But I like the Greensboro Airport, Piedmont Triad International. And I can fly into my favorite VOR, LIB, Liberty. And that will serve as a good feeder into the initial approach fix bike somewhere along here on this blue line, which is the Victor 3 airway. So let's enter that flight plan into Pilot to ATC. I'll first make sure my plan type is set to IFR. Next I'll set my cruising altitude to 7,000 feet. Then I'll use the Add Waypoint button here to create my departure airport, which is KGSO. That would be the Piedmont International Airport in Greensboro. Then I'll enter my arrival airport, which is Raleigh-Durham International, KRDU. And finally, the Liberty VOR, LIB, which will be my feeder into the approach. So that's it for the flight plan. Now we'll enter the approach. So to enter the approach, we click this approach button. And since we've entered an arrival airport, Pilot ATC offers us the approaches for Raleigh-Durham. Now, Pilot to ATC conveniently shows us the active runways for both our departure and arrival airports, and we see down here that runway 05 left is the active runway at Raleigh-Durham based on the current weather. But 5 left is the longer concrete runway used by the big toothpaste tubes, so we use 5 right instead. Here we see 3 possible approaches to choose from. First is our old friend ILS, but there's also 2 RNAV approaches called Yankee and Zulu. So let's choose the Yankee approach, RNAV 05 right Yankee. Now we'll choose the transition. First on the list is this vectors to Peckett. This is how you tell Pilot to ATC you want to receive vectors to the approach rather than flying the full procedure on your own without any further guidance from ATC. The other 2 are the initial approach fix entry points into the approach. If you were flying in from further west, you might want to choose autos since it's the most westernly of the 2 IAFs. Of course, for us, bike is the one we want to choose. Clicking load will add the approach to our flight plan. If you look down here at the bottom of the flight plan, you see Pilot to ATC has automatically assigned us a SID, a standard instrument departure, which in our case is just simply runway 32, which is the active runway at GSO. Notice there is no assignment for a STAR, a standard terminal arrival, and that's because our cruising altitude of 7,000 feet is not high enough for any of the published STARs. STARs are pretty much reserved for those big 737 fighter jets that fly at tens of thousands of feet, so it's quite rare for a GA aircraft to ever have a STAR in its flight plan. Finally, the approach we entered appears as the RNAV 05 right Yankee with the bike transition. Also notice that Pilot to ATC has placed a top of descent marker in our flight plan depicted by this green arrow. Since we chose a cruising altitude of 7,000 feet and the entry altitude at the IAF is 5,000 feet, Pilot to ATC has calculated the location of where we need to begin a comfortable descent to that altitude. So this completes the Pilot to ATC portion of our setup. Now let's talk about how to choose a good approach. Before we look at the available approaches, let's take a minute to go over the recent evolution of the modern GPS units that you'll find in both X-Plane and the flight simulator. To begin this discussion, we need to introduce a technology called WAAS. That's the Wide Area Augmentation System. You can go off and read about WAAS, but I'll just say that WAAS is an extremely accurate navigation system developed for civil aviation that has the ability to provide horizontal and vertical navigation for precision approach operations. It uses a network of precisely located ground reference stations that monitor receivers via navigation transponders on geostationary satellites. Okay, well, I obviously read that definition out of my buddy Max Trescott's GPS and WAAS instrument flying handbook, but basically WAAS is a system that uses these ground-based transmitters to send correction data to WAAS-capable GPSs. What that means to us is that all of the Garmin GPS instruments in both X-Plane and the simulator are WAAS capable, which provide approach minimums down to 250 feet and even 200 feet, making them for all intents and purposes just as capable as an ILS. And that is pretty cool. What's so cool about WAAS is that it doesn't require any ground-based equipment at the airport. Everything is done mathematically, referencing the various satellite locations. That means the FAA can chart an approach anywhere they want to on the surface of the Earth, and the accuracy of that approach will be pretty darn close to ILS. WAAS approaches are divided into 2 main categories. The more precise category is called near precision. The most precise WAAS approach type is called LPV, and that stands for Localizer Performance with Vertical Guidance. LPV minimums let you use GPS to fly an approach with vertical guidance in much the same way that you would fly an ILS approach. And what that means is you should always use an LPV approach whenever you can. An older approach type in the near precision category is LNAV+V. This type allows non-GPS equipment to utilize this technology, albeit with slightly lower minimums than LPV. The second category is called non-precision. The better of these two is called LNAV+V, which provides an advisory glide slope. This glide slope doesn't have the precision of the near precision approaches and is therefore advisory. The least precise approach of all is called LNAV because it only provides lateral guidance, no glide slope. Any GPS can use LNAV, even those that are not WAAS capable. Those of course have the highest minimums and use MDA, that is minimum descent altitude, rather than a glide slope. And it's a good idea to practice all of these, since you never know if you're going to lose glide slope maybe. Plus it's just fun. One final technology I need to mention is RPN. RPN stands for Required Navigational Performance. Now it's not directly related to WAAS, but the reason I need to mention it is because you'll see approach charts that use RPN. Most RPN approaches are not for public use, and to fly these approaches in real life you'd need a letter of authorization from the FAA, blah blah blah. But of course in game you can fly these approaches if you want. Again, I only bring this up because you're going to see RPN approaches and you may wonder what they are. Sometime around 2006, the FAA recategorized GPS under the larger category RNAV, that is Area Navigation. So you'll want to look for GPS approaches named RNAV and including GPS in the title. So with that, let's take a look at the various approaches available at Raleigh-Durham International. Today I'm trying out this cool new charting utility by Navigraph. And you know what, I've been at this almost 30 years now, and I have never used Navigraph. I just have never liked subscription-based services. But I enjoyed talking with those guys last year at FS Expo, and when I came back I decided, well, I'll just try this for a year and see if I like it. And I will have to say that it is nice to have the same charts in Pilot to ATC, and X-Plane, and in the simulator, and having everything agree with each other. And they've even integrated the charts into the G1000, which is really nice. So here we are in the charts utility. And I'll click on this little map icon and then APP, and here we have all the approach charts for all 5 runways at Raleigh-Durham. Now what's really interesting to me is that all these approaches are either ILS or RNAV approaches. All those old NDB and VOR approaches, they're all gone. I have a stack of old approach charts from the late 90s that has all of those approaches. There must have been 25 or 30 of them. Of course you see all the ILS approaches, including the Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3 for the big jets. And since we're wanting to shoot approaches for runway 05 right, and since our GPS is WAAS capable, we want to use LPV. So that narrows us down to these 2 RNAV approaches. And if you look at this last one, you see that it's an RNP, which we discussed a few minutes ago, is a not for public use approach. So that narrows us down to this RNAV GPS Yankee runway 05 right that we've been talking about. So if we click to open the chart, we see a nice Jefferson chart. And that's another thing I like about Navigraph, because I really like the look of Jefferson charts. They're easier to read, I think. Now, of course, there's tons of information about reading these charts on the internet, and I'm not going to try to teach a lesson on reading these things. I'll just say that you read these from top to bottom, left to right, go all the way down the page, and in that order you find all the information that you need. This middle section here is a plan view, which is kind of like a bird's eye view of the approach. Then you have the profile view, which shows all the altitudes and all the various waypoints on the way down. And in this last section, we find a table for all the various GPS minimums. For example, this first column, LPV, in bold-face type, we see the minimum for that is 620 feet. And if we were flying LNAV VNAV, our minimum would be 688 feet. If we were flying LNAV, our minimum would be 780 feet. And over here you see circle to land minimums, and they're quite high, 960 feet, 1020, 1180. Now what I do want to talk about are these 5 segments that are common to all approach charts. Now I'm going to turn on this cool little annotate pen thing that Navigraph has added to the latest charts. Now this first segment I want to talk about, it's not really part of the actual approach chart itself, but it's the feeder into one of these 2 initial approach fixes, autos and bike. So let's say we're coming in from the Liberty VOR, which is somewhere over in here, and we want to enter the approach at the initial approach fix bike. So there's a couple of observations here. We see that the entry altitude for bike is 5,000 feet. So that means we need to get down to that altitude from Liberty at 7,000 feet. Now here's something you may not pay attention to. See these little star symbols? Now this little star symbol over here at Zebel has got a circle around it, but the ones at bike and autos and Ratty and Peckett and Permy, they don't have circles around them. And what that means is a waypoint that doesn't have a circle around it is called a flyby waypoint. That means that you don't actually have to fly over it, you can just fly by it. However, the one at Zebel is a fly over. If it has a circle around it, that means you have to fly directly over it, which makes sense since it's a missed approach fix. You got to make sure you're flying straight over it. But the waypoints Bike, Ratty, Peckett, Permy, those are all potential entry points that ATC may vector you to when entering the approach. So it would make sense that those would be flyby because you're coming in, from some point outside the approach and merging into it. Okay, this second segment that I want to point out is actually the first segment of the approach itself. And it starts from the initial approach fix, in this case bike, and ends at the intermediate fix, or IF, which in this case is Peckett. Now there's always only one intermediate approach fix, and the purpose of this segment is to get you from whichever initial approach fix you've entered to this single point, while at the same time stepping you down in altitude. Now notice this waypoint Ratty. Ratty is not a segment endpoint. The reason this exists is to provide an altitude step down from 5,000 to 4,000 feet. Now the most important segment of all, the intermediate approach segment. This segment begins at the IF and ends at the final approach fix, or FAF. In this case that would be Peckett to Permy. And notice the little Maltese cross there at Permy. That tells us that Permy is the final approach fix. Now what's so important about this segment is it's designed primarily to position an aircraft for the final descent to the airport, which for an LPV or an ILS approach, the final approach fix is where the glide slope would begin. And another important purpose of the intermediate approach fix is to give the pilot the opportunity to prepare the aircraft for landing. This includes such things as activating the approach mode, dropping the landing gear, dropping flaps, turning on landing lights, and any other before landing checklist item. The fourth segment is the final approach. This starts at the final approach fix, or FAF, and ends at either decision height for precision or near precision approaches such as ILS or LPV, or the missed approach point, or MAP, for non-precision approaches. The final segment is the missed approach segment. If the runway is not in sight by the time you reach either decision height or the missed approach point, you must declare a missed approach and fly this segment. The missed approach segment starts at either decision height or MAP and ends at the hold, that is the missed approach fix. I'm actually excluding the missed approach from this video, although I do practice it, and it's important to practice the missed approach with and without the toga, that is the takeoff go-around button, because some aircraft don't have that button. Okay, before we leave this topic, I want to show you the newest FAA instrument approach masterpiece, and it exists solely because of the wonders of WAAS. It's called the Terminal Arrival Area, or TAA chart. And the design objective of TAAs is to provide a transition method for arriving aircraft that use RNAV equipment, specifically WAAS-capable GPS. RDU only has one of these, and it's this RNAV GPS runway 32. TAAs are designed around a T configuration. They feature 3 initial approach fixes, one on each tip of the T, the third one at the intersection that doubles as the intermediate fix. This design eliminates or reduces the need for feeder routes, departure extensions, and procedure turns or course reversals. One of the more important features of TAAs is standardization. Once you get comfortable with the design, anywhere you find one of these TAAs, you'll immediately understand how it works. The standard TA has 3 areas: straight in, left base, and right base. Regardless of the direction the aircraft is coming from, that aircraft can proceed directly to one of these 3 IAFs without any sort of feeder route or reversal. By consulting one of these 3 published bearings, the pilot can quickly determine which IAF to use based on these 2 bearings, as well as the altitude to descend to. So for this chart, an aircraft coming from the southeast would do a straight in as long as his heading is between 53 degrees and 234, and he knows to descend to 3,400 feet. Likewise, an aircraft arriving from the northeast, as long as he's between 144 degrees and 234, he would use the Scenerios IAF and do a left base. If you're coming from the southwest, you would use the Conca IAF as long as you're between 53 degrees and 144. And in all 3 cases, the descent altitude is 3,400. And also notice that this holding pattern is a no procedure turn pattern and is only used if ATC needs to keep you in a holding pattern for some reason. So the TAA is a very straightforward approach, and once you've learned one, you've learned them all. Alright then, now that we know all about approaches, we're ready to add the approach to our flight plan. First, we'll press the flight plan button and select the approach. Then we'll roll down till we find the RNAV GPS Yankee 05 right LPV, and we want to select the bike initial approach fix. And if you recall from the approach plate, LPV minimum was 620 feet. Now let's scroll through all of our waypoints, make sure everything is right, and we'll press load, which adds it to the end of our flight plan. So that completes the setup now of pilot to ATC as well as the G1000. So now we'll call up clearance delivery and we'll be on our way. First I'm going to do one final check, make sure pilot to ATC looks good. Greensboro clearance, November 227 Whiskey Alpha, ready to copy IFR clearance.
227 Whiskey Alpha is cleared to Kilo Romeo Delta uniform as filed. Expect departure runway 32. Climb and maintain 5,000 feet. Expect higher clearances 2 minutes after departure. Departure on 124.35. Squawk 3242.
227 Whiskey Alpha is cleared to Kilo Romeo Delta uniform as filed. Climb and maintain 5,000 feet. Expect higher clearances 2 minutes after departure. Departure on 124.35. Squawk 3242.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha rearback correct. Altimeter is 299.7. Contact ground on 121.9 or when ready to taxi. Have a good afternoon.
Altimeter is 299.7. Ground on 121.9 or November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Greensboro ground, November 227 Whiskey Alpha, ready to taxi.
7 Whiskey Alpha taxi to runway 32 via taxiways Mike, Charlie, hold short runway 32.
Canada 173, ground good evening, runway 23 to Zulu altimeter 2984, taxi Alpha Hotel.
Alpha Hotel, Air Canada 173.
Taxi to runway 32 via taxiways Mike Charlie hold short runway 32 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Ground Air Canada 738 with Young 15 right, short of Fox 1.
Air Canada 738, ground, exit Foxtrot 3, and then taxi Foxtrot Tango, hold short, Echo.
Foxtrot 3, Fox, Tango short of Echo, Air Canada 738.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha contact tower on 119.1. Enjoy your afternoon. Tower on 119.1 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Greensboro Tower, November 227 Whiskey Alpha, ready for departure, runway 32.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, winds are 348 at 7 knots, cleared for takeoff. Runway 32, maintain runway heading until above 1,900 feet, then turn left heading 115 to intercept course.
Cleared for takeoff runway 32, maintain runway heading until above 1,900 feet, then left to 115 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
FedEx 3023, have tower, do you have numbers for 25 right at Foxtrot?
Confirm.
FedEx 3023, heavy, cross runway 25 left, hold short, runway 25 right at Foxtrot.
Cliff cross 25 left, hold short, 25 right at Foxtrot, FedEx 3023.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, climb to 7,000 feet, contact Greensboro, departure on 124.35, enjoy.
Climb to 7,000 feet, departure on 124.35 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Greensboro departure, November 227 Whiskey Alpha is climbing to 7,000 feet.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, this is Washington Helicopter Control on 134.35, go ahead.
Greensboro departure, November 227 Whiskey Alpha is climbing to 7,000 feet.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, good afternoon. Radar contact.
Toronto Center, UPS 76, level 310, heading 061 for weather.
UPS 76, Heavy Toronto Center, good morning. When you're able to direct Mirabel on a course, Yankee Mike X-ray.
Perfect, when able, direct Yankee Mike X-ray, UPS 76. UPS 76 is direct Yankee Mike X-ray at this time.
Yes, sir.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, contact Washington Center on 124.05. Have a good afternoon.
Center on 124.05, 7 Whiskey Alpha, good day. Washington Center, November 227 Whiskey Alpha is level at 7,000 feet.
Seven Whiskey Alpha, good afternoon. Altimeter is 29906.
Altimeter 29906, 7 Whiskey Alpha.
United 1164 326, descend at 310.
United 1164, Thunder, good morning. When you're ready, descend and maintain, follow 2408 is kilo.
Okay, we got kilo down to 240, United 1164.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, contact Raleigh Aproach on 127.67, have a good afternoon.
Approach on 127.67 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
UPS 76, contact 13457, good morning.
Raleigh Approach, November 227 Whiskey Alpha is level at 7,000 feet.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, good afternoon. Expect the RNAV Yankee approach to runway 05 right with the beach transition at Raleigh Durham International.
Expect the RNAV Yankee approach to runway 05 right with the bike transition November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Georgia 7051, descend 8,000.
Descend 8,000, Georgia 7051.
Raleigh Durham International Information Charlie, 1851 Zulu winds are 009er at 9er knots gusting to 10 knots. Visibility 10 miles. 1,800 broken. 3,400 overcast. Temperature 13, dew point 8. Current altimeter is 299er3. Arriving and departing runway 05 right. Raleigh.
While we're waiting for the clearance to the approach, I want to show you what it actually means when you choose a transition when selecting an approach. I've gone on Heading Bug here and already deleted the approach that we had selected earlier. And I'm going to select it again, and this time I'm going to choose the Auto's initial approach fix. First thing to notice is that the GPS is using direct to autos, which you can see in the annunciator panel. So, choosing autos as a transition at the time of selecting an approach is exactly equivalent to highlighting that waypoint inside the flight plan and pressing the direct to button. What that means is if ATC were to change our gate, that is a different entry point, all we would need to do is open the flight plan, turn on the cursor, scroll down to the appropriate gate, and press the direct to button, and that would be exactly equivalent to selecting the gate at the time we selected the approach. The other thing to notice is that the GPS knows autos is a flyby waypoint opposed to a flyover. This information is stored in the approach database. So now if we change our gate back to bike, we see that the GPS has chosen a direct to bike, and we're right back to where we were before I deleted the approach. I plan to make another video about all of this and show the differences between what happens with the NXI in Microsoft Flight Simulator opposed to X-Plane, so stay tuned for that.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, you are 19 nautical miles southwest of Raleigh Durham International Airport. Cleared for the RNAV approach to runway 05 right at Raleigh Durham International with the beach transition.
Cleared for the RNAV approach to runway 05 right with the bike transition November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
April 7519, cleared ILS 24 right, descend on the glide path.
Cleared ILS 24 right, descend on the glide path, April 7519.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha altimeter is 299.3 at Raleigh Durham International Contact Tower on 119.3. Enjoy your afternoon.
Altimeter is 299.3 tower on 119.3 November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Raleigh Tower, November 227 Whiskey Alpha with Charlie, inbound for RNAV approach, runway 05 right.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, good afternoon. Continue RNAV to runway 05 right, call when established on final.
Continue RNAV approach to runway 05 right, will call when established on final. November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Okay, so this is the final approach segment. The most critical part of this segment is to make sure that we're in approach mode. I'm pressing the approach button now. Otherwise, the aircraft will not descend once we reach the glide path. Now that that's done, we can perform the rest of the landing checklist, which includes making sure our mixture is rich, turn on the fuel boost pump, set our fuel selector to the fullest tank, and turn on our landing lights. Now, the approach chart designers have provided a leveling out phase of the final approach segment, which provides the pilot the opportunity to reduce airspeed to flaps conditions. So we'll use this time to reduce our speed to the top of the white arc and drop a notch of flaps. Then we'll complete whatever remaining items there are on the landing checklist. So now we're coming up on the final segment, the missed approach segment. The segment begins at the final approach fix, Permi. Now at this point the glide path is above us, and since we're flying straight and level at the published altitude of 2200 feet, we should intercept that glide path exactly at the final approach fix. And since we've set the GPS to approach mode, the GPS will capture the glide path and begin a 3-degree descent to decision altitude. Once we reach decision altitude, we'll have to decide if we're actually going to land or go missed approach. Now, as I said before, in this video we're not going to do a missed approach, although I encourage you to practice those. So as we approach the final approach fix here, we're watching the annunciator for the glide path indicator to turn green. So the GPS has now captured the glide path.
Runway Zulu Delta, right turn runway 05, then head back for more, continue right into Bravo and give us a call holding short of runway 30.
Runway Zulu Delta, continue all the way to back to the active.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, established on final, runway 05 right.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, winds are 009er at 9er knots, gusts to 17 knots, cleared to land runway 05 right.
Cleared to land runway 05 right. November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, you have traffic at 9 o'clock 1 miles at 1,900 feet.
Traffic in sight, 7 Whiskey Alpha. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this rather detailed video, and maybe you've picked up a thing or two along the way. I still have a lot to learn about this NXI, but Working Title has done a marvelous job on this thing. In the past, I always had a lot of trouble with things like VNAV and Direct to and the Activate leg, and they seem to have really fixed a lot of that stuff. So I hope maybe I've encouraged you to explore the marvelous NXI. Well, that's really it. Stick around if you want to watch this attempt at landing in these high winds. But either way, I appreciate you watching, and see you next time.
Golf Oscar Yankee Juliet, wind is light and variable, clear to land runway 30.
That's Oscar Yankee Juliet.
And Mike Killer Zero, just for my planning, how many touch and goes are you going to do this evening?
I'm going to do 3 and then a full stop, please.
Understood.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha exit runway when able.
Seven Whiskey Alpha is clear of the active.
November 7 Whiskey Alpha, welcome to Raleigh Durham International, contact ground on 121.9er. Have a nice day.
Ground on 121.9 or 7 Whiskey Alpha, good day. Raleigh ground, November 227 Whiskey Alpha, request taxi to general aviation parking.
Seven Whiskey Alpha taxi to general aviation parking via taxiways Alpha, Alpha 7, Juliet, Juliet 2.
Taxi to general aviation parking via taxiways Alpha, Alpha 7, Juliet, Juliet 2, November 7 Whiskey Alpha.
Southwest 3533, Takeoff.
2433 is clear, 1 runway 3.
Southwest 3533, Takeoff.
You're in for 2433.
That was for Skywest 3533, Takeoff. Southwest 2433 behind the 757, Takeoff 3.
Ram 3 behind the Delta, Southwest 2433.